My 9 new favorite historical fiction books of all time. How many of these on this list have you read? How many do you want to read? And most important, how many of them are you going to put on your TBR? Now, I decided to do this video because about a year ago, I did a video on what are my favorite historical fiction books of all time. It's actually the video that's gotten the most views on this YouTube channel. So since it's been about a year and since I've done a ton of reading since then, I wanted to ask myself, are there any new books that I really love? Are there any books that might push the other ones off the list? So just for clarity's sake, I'm just going to briefly mention what those 10 books were that I mentioned a year ago. It's funny when I look at the list because I feel like some of these I wouldn't put on there anymore and some of them I still would have. So just to let you know, the ones that were on that list before were Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, still one of my favorites of all time, Kindred by Octavia Butler, Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Katu, The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, and Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. So yeah, I feel like some of them I probably wouldn't still have, some of them I definitely would, but now let's get into this list of my favorites really in the last year or since I've made that video. And let me know in the comments down below, how many of these have you read? And most important, how many are you going to put on your TBR? Now first, let's start with Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. So this is a book that I typically wouldn't like. I typically don't like Westerns, but the reason that I picked up this book is because I've seen it on BookTube so many times, and people have often said that, you know, they don't like Westerns either. But this book, the characters are just so alive and they just come off the page and they become real, and it's a real, beautiful reading experience. So that's why I wanted to read this one, and they are correct. It is a brutal book, very brutal, but at the same time, the characters are just so vivid. It's basically about two Texas Rangers that decide they want to go on a cattle drive from this border town in Texas and they want to go to Montana. And it's basically just the story of this adventure. But yeah, I feel like it's so hard as a writer to write characters that come off the page and that seem alive. And these characters really do. My only sort of criticism of this book is that I actually didn't realize it was part of a series. I felt like the end of the book was a little bit like up in the air. So yeah, that's kind of my only criticism. So on the last time I did this video, I did mention The Kite Runner, and I will have to say that since then I've read 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini, and I would probably say that this one actually is my favorite of Khaled Hosseini's books. As I was mentioning with Lonesome Dove, I mean, it's all about the characters, right? I mean, these characters just come off the page. But this is about two women who form an unlikely friendship. The period of time that it covers is, you know, Soviet era rule over Afghanistan on into Taliban rule. Like a lot of historical fiction, it is a hard book. There's a lot of hard themes. You know, I wouldn't recommend reading these 10 books that I'm gonna talk about all in a row because you'll probably get pretty depressed. But it is a beautiful book, and it's just a book about friendship and love and perseverance and making it through despite all of the things that are going on around you. So the next one I have is In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. I actually listened to this one, and the reason I put this one on the list is because it's a World War I book, and I love World War I, and I just thought it was so well researched. I've done a lot of reading myself about World War I. I've read a lot of memoirs. I've read, you know, a lot of histories, you know, people just writing books about exactly what happened. And I felt that Alice Wynne, she so vividly wrought sort of the cultural ethos of what was going on during that period of time. But it was really about, you know, two young men living in England. One of them is half German. And, you know, just what happens to them when this war breaks out. Next up is Snow Falling on Cedars by David Gutterson. Now, this book is kind of a dual timeline. So it's a World War II novel, but it really focuses on what happened to the Japanese population in the Pacific Northwest during World War II, because there were many internment camps and many of the Japanese, or I should say, you know, all of the Japanese were basically taken away to the internment camps and forced to live there. So it's about that and about the aftermath of that in terms of this particular community in the Pacific Northwest, as well as it's a murder mystery as well. So this book is very propulsive. It keeps you turning the page. Very beautiful writing. There's also a little element of unrequited love in the story, which that's just a theme that I really like to read about. So overall, just a very propulsive and well-wrought and well-researched and just very well-written novel. Next up is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Now I have to say that this is probably one of my favorite books of all time. So it's moved on up the list in terms of my favorite historical fiction and favorite books of all time. So this book is about an African-American woman who grows up in the early 1900s and basically just onward in her life. And basically it just talks about, what she has to endure in the Deep South as an African-American woman. And it does it through letters, through her letters to God, through her letters to her sister. And even though there are a lot of really hard themes in this book, as you might imagine, abuse, sexual abuse, racism, all these sorts of things, it's also filled with such hope. And also I feel like it kind of describes, what is God? What does that even mean? It was a great book. Next up is Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. And yes, I know if you have read this book or attempted to read this book, I do know that parts of it can be extremely tedious, but I will say that it is worth the tedious parts. A lot of people think this book is about the French Revolution. It's actually not. It is about the June Rebellion of 1832. It's not just about that. But that's one of the center events that it sort of really revolves around. But this is just such a beautiful book about a cast of characters who are living in Paris, in the early 1800s. And overall, it's really just a story about love, the story of the love between a father and a daughter, the story of the love between a man and a woman. It's just a beautiful book and it's worth it. I did it as a buddy read, which I recommend because sometimes you do need someone to push you through, especially the part about argot, which is basically slang. So Victor Hugo, he likes to go on diatribes. He likes to just talk about things that nobody really even understands anymore because it's about these very small minutiae of politics that, have been lost to history. But as I will say again, it's worth it. Definitely worth it. Next up is Middlemarch by George Eliot. So this book surprised me. I've always heard that, this is one of the greatest books ever written in the English language. And I finally decided to pick it up and I actually listened to it. I recommend listening to the audio by Juliet Stevenson. It's a great way to read this book because this book is archaic in its language. I definitely had to pause many times to look up words or look up things that I didn't really understand in the audio. But what I was surprised by was just how towards the end of the book, I'd say after I'd gotten, maybe like 2/3 of the way through, just how propulsive it was and just how much I couldn't stop listening and just how much I wanted to find out what happened. So this book is about a cast of characters during the Reform era in England who all live in a made-up place called Middlemarch. And really, it's so brilliant just how all these stories tie together. But not only that, I thought it was just going to be, vignettes about these people's life, but it wasn't. All of the stories were interrelated, and there really was a lot of drama that I was really interested to find out what happened. Next up is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. So this is a very famous book. You've probably heard of this book. You've probably read it, but it is a very beautiful book. So it's a World War II novel, and it's really about two different characters. One is a German boy who sort of gets swept up into, what's happening in Germany. He's very intelligent. He's really good with radios. So as you might imagine, the Nazis really want to use him. And then it's also about a French girl, a blind girl who evacuates from Paris. She may or may not have a priceless diamond on her person because her father used to be, the key master at the Natural History Museum in Paris. Now this book is a quiet book. It's a beautiful book. And ultimately it's just about, even during horrible times, how people can stand up for what's right and stand up for each other, even if that means that they are going to be in danger because of it. Now, last up, I am putting Charlotte Gray by Sebastian Faulks on here. So this one is a little bit of a caveat because it's nowhere near as good as Birdsong. Birdsong is a World War I novel. This is a loose sequel to Birdsong. There actually is one little connection to the characters in Birdsong in this book, so there's like a little Easter egg in it. And I will say that Charlotte Gray is a lot slower than Birdsong. I would say, maybe even struggled to get through it. However, I will say that one thing that Sebastian Faulks does such a good job of as a writer and why I had to put it on the list is because he just creates the history so realistically that you feel like you're there. And he does it with such nuance. nuance. So this book is about Charlotte Gray and how she becomes a spy and goes into France because she is looking for an airman who she is in love with, who has crashed. He's a British soldier who has crashed in France. But what's so interesting about this book and why, even though it was slow, I couldn't stop reading it is because he talks about the nuance of France. He talks about, how in a lot of ways the French police were just as guilty as the Nazis, if not more guilty in terms of what happened in the Holocaust. He talks about how, a lot of the French population, they didn't really fight back. I mean, I think a lot of books now, they really focus on the French resistance. But in this book, he talks about the nuance. He talks about how it really was. And of course, I don't know how it really was because I wasn't there. He also wasn't there. However, it just feels so realistic compared to a lot of other World War II novels that I've read. Well, there you go. Those are my 10 new favorite historical fiction novels of all time. As I said, I'd probably switch out some of the ones that are on my old list with some of the ones that are here. I'll always keep Pillars of the Earth way up high, but yes, I definitely would change some of them. And let me know in the comments down below, which ones of these have you read, which one do you plan to read, and which one are you going to bump up on your TBR? And as always, happy reading.